The House of the Vampire by George Sylvester Viereck. Chapter 17. The next day Ernest wrote a letter of more or less superficial tenderness to Ethel. She had wounded his pride by proving victorious in the end over his passion and hers. Besides, he was in the throes of work. When after the third day no answer came, he was inclined to feel aggrieved. It was plain now that she had not cared for him in the least, but had simply played with him for lack of another toy. A flush of shame rose to his cheeks at the thought. He began to analyze his own emotions, and stunned, if not stabbed, his passions step by step. Work was calling to him. It was that which gave life its meaning, not the love of a season. How far away, how unreal she now seemed to him. Yes, she was right. He had not cared deeply, and his novel, too, would be written only at her. It was the heroine of his story that absorbed his interest, not the living prototype. Once in a conversation with Reginald he touched upon the subject. Reginald held that modern taste no longer permitted even the photographer to portray life as it is, but insisted upon an individual visualization. No man, he remarked, was ever translated bodily into fiction. In contradiction to life, art is a process of artificial selection. Bearing in mind this motive, Ernest went to work to mould from the material in hand a new Ethel, more real than life. Unfortunately, he found little time to devote to his novel. It was only when, after a good day's work, a pile of copy for a magazine lay on his desk, that he could think of concentrating his mind upon Leontina. The result was that when he went to bed his imagination was busy with the plan of his book, and the creatures of his own brain laid their fingers on his eyelid so that he could not sleep. When at last sheer weariness overcame him, his mind was still at work, not in orderly sequence, but along trails monstrous and grotesque. Hobgoblins seemed to steal through the hall, and leering incubi oppressed his soul with terrible burdens. In the morning he awoke unrested. The tan vanished from his face, and little lines appeared in the corners of his mouth. It was as if his nervous vitality were sapped from him in some unaccountable way. He became excited, hysterical. Often at night, when he wrote his pot-boilers for the magazines, fear stood behind his seat, and only the buzzing of the elevator outside brought him back to himself. In one of his morbid moods he wrote a sonnet which he showed to Reginald after the latter's returned from a short trip out of town. Reginald read it, looking at the boy with a curious, lurking expression. O gentle sleep, turn not thy face away, but place thy finger on my brow, and take all burdens from me, and all dreams that ache. Upon mine eyes a cooling balsam lay, seeing I am aweary of the day. But lo, thy lips are ashen, and they quake. What spectral vision sees thou that can shake thy sweet composure, and thy heart dismay? Perhaps some murderer's cruel eye a gleam is fixed upon me, or some monstrous dream might bring such fearful guilt upon the head of my unvigilant soul as would arouse the Borgian snake from her envenomed bed, or startle Nero in his golden house. Good stuff, Reginald remarked, laying down the manuscript. When did you write it? The night when you were out of town, Ernest rejoined. I see, Reginald replied. There was something startling in his intonation that at once aroused Ernest's attention. What do you see? He asked quickly. Nothing, Reginald replied, with immovable calm. Only that your state of nerves is still far from satisfactory. Chapter 18. After Ernest's departure, Ethel Brandenburg's heart was swaying hither and thither in a hurricane of conflicting feelings. Before she had time to gain an emotional equilibrium, his letter had hurled her back into chaos. A false ring somewhere in Ernest's words, re-echoing with an ever-increasing volume of sound, stifled the voice of love. His jewelled sentences glittered, but left her cold. They lacked that spontaneity which renders even simple and hackneyed phrases wonderful and unique. Ethel clearly realized that her hold upon the boy's imagination had been a fleeting midsummer night's charm, and that a word from Reginald's lips had broken the potency of her spell. She almost saw the shadow of Reginald's visage hovering over Ernest's letter and leering at her from between the lines in sinister triumph. Finally reason came and whispered to her that it was extremely unwise to give her heart into the keeping of the boy. His love, she knew, would have been exacting, irritating at times. He would have asked her to sympathize with every phase of his life, and would have expected active interest on her part in much that she had done with long ago. Thus untruth would have stolen into her life and embittered it. When mates are unequal, love must paint its cheeks, and in certain moods at least hide its face under a mask. Its lips may be honeyed, but it brings fret and sorrow in its train. These things she told herself over and over again while she penned a cool and calculating answer to Ernest's letter. She rewrote it many times, and every time it became more difficult to reply. At last she put her letter aside for a few days, and when it fell again into her hand it seemed so unnatural and strained that she destroyed it. Thus several weeks had passed, and Ernest no longer exclusively occupied her mind, when one day in early September, while glancing over a magazine, she came upon his name in the table of contents. Once more she saw the boy's wistful face before her, and a trembling something stirred in her heart. Her hand shook as she cut the pages, and a mist of tears clouded her vision as she attempted to read his poem. It was a piece of sombre brilliance. Like black-draped monks half crazed with mystic devotion, the poet's thoughts flitted across the page. It was the wail of a soul that feels reason slipping from it, and beholds madness rise over its life like a great pale moon. A strange unrest emanated from it and took possession of her. And again, with an insight that was prophetic, she distinctly recognized behind the vague fear that had haunted the poet the figure of Reginald Clark. A half-forgotten dream, struggling to consciousness, staggered her by its vividness. She saw Clark as she had seen him in days gone by, grotesquely transformed into a slimy sea-thing, whose hungry mouth shut sucking upon her, and whose thousand tentacles encircled her form. She closed her eyes in horror at the reminiscence, and in that moment it became clear to her that she must take into her hands the salvation of Ernest Fielding from the clutches of the malign power that had mysteriously enveloped his life. Chapter 19. The summer was brief, and already by the middle of September many had returned to the pleasures of urban life. Ethel was among the first comers, for after her resolve to enter the life of the young poet once more it would have been impossible for her to stay away from the city much longer. Her plan was all ready. Before attempting to see Ernest she would go to meet Reginald and implore him to free the boy from his hideous spell. An element of curiosity unconsciously entered her determination. When, years ago, she and Clark had parted, the man had seemed for once greatly disturbed, and had promised, in his agitation, that some day he would communicate to her what would exonerate him in her eyes. She had answered that all words between them were purposeless, and that she hoped never to see his face again. The experience that the years had brought to her, instead of elucidating the mystery of Reginald's personality, had, on the contrary, made his behaviour appear more and more unaccountable. She had more than once caught herself wishing to meet him again, and to analyze dispassionately the puzzling influences he had exerted upon her. And she could at last view him dispassionately. There was triumph in that. She was dimly aware that something had passed from her, something by which he had held her, and without which his magnetism was unable to play upon her. So when Walcom sent her an invitation to one of his artistic at-homes, she accepted, in the hope of meeting Reginald. It was his frequentation of Walcom's house that had for several years effectively barred her foot from crossing the threshold. It was with a very strange feeling that she greeted the many familiar faces at Walcom's now, and when, toward 10 o'clock, Reginald entered, politely bowing in answer to the welcome from all sides, her heart beat in her like a drum. But she calmed herself, and catching his eye, so arranged it that early in the evening they met in an alcove of the drawing-room. "It was inevitable," Reginald said. "I expected it." "Yes," she replied, "we were bound to meet." Like a great rush of water, memory came back to her. He was still horribly fascinating as of old, only she was no longer susceptible to his fascination. He had changed somewhat in those years. The lines about his mouth had grown harder, and a steel-like look had come into his eyes. Only for a moment, as he looked at her, a flash of tenderness seemed to come back to them. Then he said, with a touch of sadness, "Why should the first word between us be a lie?" Ethel made no answer. Reginald looked at her half in wonder, and said, "And is your love for the boy so great that it overcame your hate of me?" Ah, he knew. She winced. "He has told you?" "Not a word." There was something superhuman in his power of penetration. Why should she wear a mask before him, when his eyes, like the eyes of God, pierced to the core of her being? "No," she replied. "It is not love, but compassion for him." "Compassion?" "Yes, compassion for your victim." "You mean—" "Reginald!" "I am all ear." "I implore you." "Speak." "You have ruined one life." He raised his eyebrows derogatively. "Yes," she continued fiercely, "ruined it. Is not that enough?" "I have never wilfully ruined anyone's life." "You have ruined mine." "Wilfully?" "How else shall I explain your conduct?" "I warned you." "Warning indeed! The warning that the snake gives to the sparrow helpless under its gaze." "Ah, but who tells you that the snake is to blame? Is it not rather the occult power that prescribes with blood on brazen scroll the law of our being?" "This is no solace to the sparrow. But whatever may be said, let us drop the past. Let us consider the present. I beg of you, leave this boy. Let him develop without your attempting to stifle the life in him or impressing upon it the stamp of your alien mind." "Ethel," he protested, "you are unjust. If you knew—" Then an idea seemed to take hold of him. He looked at her curiously. "What if I knew?" she asked. "You shall know," he said simply. "Are you strong?" "Strong to withstand anything at your hand. There is nothing that you can give me, nothing that you can take away." "No," he remarked, "nothing. Yes, you have changed. Still, when I look upon you, the ghosts of the past seem to rise like live things." "We both have changed. We now meet upon equal grounds. You are no longer the idol I made of you." "Don't you think that to the idol this might be a relief, not a humiliation? It is a terrible torture to sit in state with lips eternally shut. Sometimes there comes over the most reticent of us a desire to break through the eternal loneliness that surrounds the soul. It is this feeling that prompts madmen to tear off their clothes and exhibit their nakedness in the market-place. It's madness on my part, or a whim, or I don't know what, but it pleases me that you should know the truth." "You promised me long ago that I should." "Today I will redeem my promise, and I will tell you another thing that you will find hard to believe." "And that is?" "That I loved you." Ethel smiled a little skeptically. "You have loved often." "No," he replied. "Loved, seriously loved, I have only once." End of section 9. The House of the Vampire by George Sylvester Viereck. Chapter 20. They were sitting in a little Italian restaurant where they had often in the old days lingered late into the night over a glass of Lacrymae Christi. But no pale ghost of the past rose from the wine, only a wriggling something with serpent eyes that sent cold shivers down her spine and held her speechless and entranced. When their order had been filled and the waiter had posted himself at a respectful distance, Reginald began, at first leisurely, a man of the world, but as he proceeded a strange exultation seemed to possess him, and from his eyes leaped the flame of the mystic. "You must pardon me," he commenced, "if I monopolize the conversation, but the revelations I have to make are of such a nature that I may well claim your attention. I will start with my earliest childhood. You remember the picture of me that was taken when I was 5?" She remembered indeed. Each detail of his life was deeply engraven on her mind. "At that time," he continued, "I was not held to be particularly bright. The reason was that my mind, being preeminently and extraordinarily receptive, needed a stimulus from without. The moment I was sent to school, however, a curious metamorphosis took place in me. I may say that I became at once the most brilliant boy in my class. You know that to this day I have always been the most striking figure in any circle in which I have ever moved." Ethel nodded assent. Silently watching the speaker, she saw a gleam of the truth from afar, but still very distant and very dim. Reginald lifted the glass against the light and gulped its contents. Then in a lower voice he recommenced, "Like the chameleon, I have the power of absorbing the color of my environment." "Do you mean that you have the power of absorbing the special virtues of other people?" she interjected. "That is exactly what I mean." "Oh!" she cried, for in a heartbeat many things had become clear to her. For the first time she realized, still vaguely but with increasing vividness, the hidden causes of her ruin, and still more plainly the horrible danger of Ernest Fielding. He noticed her agitation, and a look of psychological curiosity came into his eyes. "Ah, but that is not all," he observed smilingly. "That is nothing. We all possess that faculty in a degree. The secret of my strength is my ability to reject every element that is harmful or inessential to the completion of myself. This did not come to me easily, nor without a struggle. But now, looking back upon my life, many things became transparent that were obscure even to me at the time. I can now follow the fine-spun threads in the intricate web of my fate, and discover in the wilderness of meshes a design, awful and grandly planned." His voice shook with conviction as he uttered these words. There was something strangely gruesome in this man. It was thus that she had pictured to herself the high priest of some terrible and mysterious religion, demanding a human sacrifice to appease the hunger of his god. She was fascinated by the spell of his personality, and listened with a feeling not far removed from awe. But Reginald suddenly changed his tone, and proceeded in a more conversational manner. "The first friend I ever cared for was a boy marvellously endowed for the study of mathematics. At the time of our first meeting at school, I was unable to solve even the simplest algebraical problem. But when we had been together only for half a month, when we exchanged parts, it was I who was the mathematical genius now, whereas he became hopelessly dull and stuttered through his recitations only with a struggle that brought the tears to his eyes. Then I discarded him. Heartless, you say? I have come to know better. Have you ever tasted a bottle of wine that had been uncorked for a long time? If you have probably found it flat. The essence was gone, evaporated. Thus it is when we care for people. Probably, no, assuredly, there is some principle prisoned in their souls or in the windings of their brains, which when escaped leaves them insipid, unprofitable, and devoid of interest to us. Sometimes this essence, not necessarily the finest element in a man's or woman's nature, but soul stuff that we lack, disappears. In fact, it invariably disappears. It may be that it has been transformed in the process of their growth. It may also be that it has utterly vanished by some inadvertence, or that we ourselves have absorbed it." "Then we throw them away?" Ethel asked, pale but dry-eyed. A shudder passed through her body, and she clinched her glass nervously. At that moment Reginald resembled a veritable prince of darkness, sinister and beautiful, painted by the hand of a modern master. Then for a space he again became the man of the world. Smiling and self-possessed, he filled the glasses, took a long sip of the wine, and resumed his narrative. "That boy was followed by others. I absorbed many useless things, and some that were evil. I realized that I must direct my absorptive propensities. This I did. I selected well, and all the time the terrible power of which I was only half conscious grew within me." "It is indeed a terrible power," she cried, "all the more terrible for its subtlety. Had I not myself been its victim, I should not now find it possible to believe in it." "The invisible hand that smites in the dark is certainly more fearful than a visible foe. It is also more merciful. Think how much you would have suffered had you been conscious of your loss." "Still it seems even now to me that it cannot have been an utter, irreparable loss. There is no action without reaction. Even we must have received from you some compensation for what you have taken away." "In the ordinary processes of life the law of action and reaction is indeed potent, but no law is without its exception. Think of radium, for instance, with its constant and seemingly inexhaustible outflow of energy. It is a difficult thing to imagine, but our scientific men have accepted it as a fact. Why should we find it more difficult to conceive of a tremendous and infinite absorptive element? I feel sure that it must somewhere phenomenon in the physical world finds its counterpart in the psychical universe. There are radium souls that radiate without loss of energy, but also without increase. And there are souls, the reverse of radium, with unlimited absorptive capabilities." "Vampire souls," she observed with a shudder, and her face blanched. "No," he said, "don't say that." And then he suddenly seemed to grow in stature. His face was ablaze like the face of a god. "In every age," he replied with solemnity, "there are giants who attain to a greatness which by natural growth no men could ever have reached. But in their youth a vision came to them, which they set out to seek. They take the stones of fancy to build them a palace in the kingdom of truth, projecting into reality dreams, monstrous and impossible. Often they fail, and tumbling from their airy heights end a quixotic career. Some succeed. They are the chosen. Carpenters' sons they are, who have laid down the law of a world for millenniums to come, or simple Corsicans, before whose eagle eyes have quaked the kingdoms of the earth. But to accomplish their mission they need a will of iron and the wit of 100 men, and from the iron they take the strength, and from 100 men's brains they absorb their wisdom. Divine missionaries, they appear in all departments of life. In their hand is gathered today the gold of the world. Mighty potentates of peace and war, they unlock new seas and from distant continents lift the bars. Single-handed they accomplish what nations dared not hope. With Titan strides they scale the stars and succeed where millions fail. In art they live, the makers of new periods, the dreamers of new styles. They make themselves the vocal sunglasses of God. Homer and Shakespeare, Hugo and Balzac, they concentrate the dispersed rays of 1,000 lesser luminaries in one singing flame that like a giant torch lights up humanity's path." She gazed at him open-mouthed. The light had gone from his visage. He paused, exhausted, but even then he looked the incarnation of a force no less terrible, no less grand. She grasped the immensity of his conception, but her woman's soul rebelled at the horrible injustice to those whose light is extinguished, as hers had been, to feed an alien flame. And then for a moment she saw the pale face of Ernest staring at her out of the wine. "Cruel," she sobbed. "How cruel!" "What matter?" he asked. "Their strength is taken from them, but the spirit of humanity, as embodied in us, triumphantly marches on." End of section 10. The House of the Vampire by George Sylvester Viereck. Chapter 21. Reginald's revelations were followed by a long silence, interrupted only by the officiousness of the waiter. The spell once broken, they exchanged a number of more or less irrelevant observations. Ethel's mind returned again and again to the word he had not spoken. He had said nothing of the immediate bearing of his monstrous power upon her own life and that of Ernest Fielding. At last, somewhat timidly, she approached the subject. "You said you loved me," she remarked. "I did." "But why, then?" "I could not help it." "Did you ever make the slightest attempt?" "In the horrible night hours I struggled against it. I even implored you to leave me." "Ah, but I loved you." "You would not be warned. You would not listen. You stayed with me, and slowly, surely, the creative urge went out of your life." "But what on earth could you find in my poor art to attract you? What were my pictures to you?" "I needed them. I needed you. It was a certain something, a rich colour effect, perhaps. And then, under your very eyes, the colour that vanished from your canvases reappeared in my prose. My style became more luxurious than it had been, while you tortured your soul in the vain attempt of calling back to your brush what was irretrievably lost. Why did you not tell me? You would have laughed in my face, and I could not have endured your laugh. Besides, I always hoped, until it was too late, that I might yet check the mysterious power within me. Soon, however, I became aware that it was beyond my control. The unknown God whose instrument I am had wisely made it stronger than me. But why, retorted Ethel, was it necessary to discard me like a cast-off garment, like a wanton who has lost the power to please? Her frame shook with the remembered emotion of that moment, when years ago he had politely told her that she was nothing to him. "The law of being," Reginald replied, almost sadly. "The law of my being. I should have pitied you, but the eternal reproach of your suffering only provoked my anger. I cared less for you every day, and when I had absorbed all of you that my growth required, you were to me as one dead, as a stranger you were. There was between us no further community of interest. Henceforth, I knew, our lives must move in totally different spheres. You remember that day when we said good-bye?" "You mean that day when I lay before you on my knees," she corrected him. "The day I buried my last dream of personal happiness. I would have gladly raised you from the floor, but love was utterly gone. If I am tenderer to-day than I am wont to be, it is because you mean so much to me as the symbol of my renunciation. When I realized that I could not even save the thing I loved from myself, I became hardened and cruel to others. Not that I know no kindly feeling, but no qualms of conscience lay their prostrate forms across my path. There is nothing in life for me but my mission." His face was bathed in ecstasy. The pupils were luminous, large, and threatening. He had the look of a madman or a prophet. After a while Ethel remarked, "But you have grown into one of the master figures of the age. Why not be content with that? Is there no limit to your ambition?" Reginald smiled. Ambition? Shakespeare stopped when he had reached his full growth, when he had exhausted the capacities of his contemporaries. I am not yet ready to lay down my pen and rest. "And will you always continue in this criminal course, a murderer of other lives?" He looked her calmly in the face. "I do not know." "Are you the slave of your unknown God?" "We are all slaves, wire-pulled marionettes. You, Ernest, I. There is no freedom on the face of the earth nor above. The tiger that tears a lamb is not free. I am not free. You are not free. All that happens must happen. No word that is said in vain. In vain is raised no hand." "Then," Ethel retorted eagerly, "if I attempted to wrest your victim from you, I should also be the tool of your God?" "Assuredly. But I am his chosen." Can you not set him free?" "I need him. A little longer. Then he is yours." "But can you not, if I beg you again on my knees, at least loosen his chains before he is utterly ruined?" "It is beyond my power. If I could not rescue you, whom I loved, what in heaven or on earth can save him from his fate? Besides, he will not be utterly ruined. It is only a part of him that I absorb. In his soul are chords that I have not touched. They may vibrate one day when he has gathered new strength. You, too, would have spared yourself much pain had you striven to attain success in different fields, not where I had garnered the harvest of a lifetime. It is only a portion of his talent that I take from him. The rest I cannot harm. Why should he bury that remainder?" His eyes strayed through the window to the firmament, as if to say that words could no more bend his indomitable will than alter the changeless course of the stars. Ethel had half forgotten the wrong she had herself suffered at his hands. He could not be measured by ordinary standards, this dazzling madman, whose diseased will-power had assumed such uncanny proportions. But here a young life was at stake. In her mind's eye she saw Reginald crush between his relentless hands the delicate soul of Ernest Fielding, as a magnificent carnivorous flower might close its glorious petals upon a fly. Love, all-conquering love, welled up in her. She would fight for Ernest as a tiger-cat fights for its young. She would place herself in the way of the awful force that had shattered her own aspirations, and save at any cost the brilliant boy who did not love her. Chapter 22. The last rays of the late afternoon sun fell slanting through Ernest's window. He was lying on his couch in a leaden, death-like slumber that, for the moment at least, was not even perturbed by the presence of Reginald Clark. The latter was standing at the boy's bedside, calm, unmoved as ever. The excitement of his conversation with Ethel had left no trace on the chiselled contour of his forehead. Smilingly fastening an orchid of an indefinable purple tint in his evening coat, radiant, buoyant with life, he looked down upon the sleeper. Then he passed his hand over Ernest's forehead, as if to wipe off beads of sweat. At the touch of his hand the boy stirred uneasily. When it was not withdrawn, his countenance twitched in pain. He moaned as men moan under the influence of some anaesthetic, without possessing the power to break through the narrow partition that separates them from death on the one side and from consciousness on the other. At last a sigh struggled to his seemingly paralyzed lips, then another. Finally the babbling became articulate. "For God's sake," he cried in his sleep, "take that hand away." And all at once the benignant smile on Reginald's features was changed to a look of savage fierceness. He no longer resembled the man of culture, but a disappointed, snarling beast of prey. He took his hand from Ernest's forehead, and retired cautiously through the half-open door. Hardly had he disappeared when Ernest woke. For a moment he looked around, like a hunted animal, then sighed with relief and buried his head in his hand. At that moment a knock at the door was heard, and Reginald re-entered, calm as before. "I declare," he exclaimed, "you have certainly been sleeping the sleep of the just." "It isn't laziness," Ernest replied, looking up rather pleased at the interruption, "but I've a splitting headache." "Perhaps those naps are not good for your health." "Probably. But of late I have frequently found it necessary to exact from the day hours the sleep which the night refuses me. I suppose it is all due to indigestion, as you have suggested. The stomach is the source of all evil." "It is also the source of all good. The Greeks made it the seat of the soul. I have always claimed that the most important item in a great poet's biography is an exact reproduction of his menu." "True. A man who eats a heavy beefsteak for breakfast in the morning is incapable of writing a sonnet in the afternoon." "Yes," Reginald added, "we are what we eat, and what our forefathers have eaten before us. I ascribe the staleness of American poetry to the griddle cakes of our Puritan ancestors. I am sorry we cannot go deeper into the subject at present, but I have an invitation to dinner where I shall study, experimentally, the influence of French sauces on my versification." "Good-bye." "Au revoir." And with a wave of the hand Reginald left the room. When the door had closed behind him, Ernest's thoughts took a more serious turn. The tone of light bantering in which the preceding conversation had taken place had been assumed on his part. For the last few weeks evil dreams had tortured his sleep and cast their shadow upon his waking hours. They had ever increased in reality, in intensity, and in hideousness. Even now he could see the long tapering fingers that every night were groping in the windings of his brain. It was a well-formed, manicured hand that seemed to reach under his skull, carefully feeling its way through the myriad convolutions where thought resides. And oh, the agony of it all! A human mind is not a thing of stone, but alive, horribly alive to pain. What was it those fingers sought? What mysterious treasures, what jewels hidden in the underlayer of his consciousness? His brain was like a human gold mine, quaking under the blow of the pick and the tread of the miner. The miner! Ah, the miner! Ceaselessly, thoroughly, relentlessly, he opened vein after vein and wrested untold riches from the quivering ground, but each vein was a live vein, and each nugget of gold a thought. No wonder the boy was a nervous wreck. Whenever a tremulous nascent idea was formulating itself, the dream hand clutched it and took it away, brutally severing the fine threads that bind thought to thought. And when the morning came, how his head ached! It was not an acute pain, but dull, heavy, incessant. These sensations, Ernest frequently told himself, were morbid fantasies. But then the monomaniac who imagines that his arms have been mangled or cut from his body might as well be without arms. Mind can annihilate obstacles. It can also create them. Psychology was no unfamiliar ground to Ernest, and it was not difficult for him to seek in some casual suggestion an explanation for his delusion, the fixed notion that haunted him day and night. But he also realized that to explain a phenomenon is not to explain it away. The man who analyzes his emotions cannot wholly escape them, and the shadow of fear, primal, inexplicable fear, may darken at moments of weakness the life of the subtlest psychologist and the cleverest thinker. He had never spoken to Reginald of his terrible nightmares. Coming on the heel of the fancy that he, Ernest, had written The Princess with the Yellow Veil, a fancy, by the way, had again possessed him of late, this new delusion would certainly arouse suspicion as to his sanity in Reginald's mind. He would probably send him to a sanitarium. He certainly would not keep him in the house. Beneficence itself in all other things, his host was not to be trifled with in any matter that interfered with his work. He would act swiftly and without mercy. For the first time in many days Ernest thought of Abel Felton. Poor boy! What had become of him after he had been turned from the house? He would not wait for anyone to tell him to pack his bundle. But then that was impossible. Reginald was fond of him. Suddenly Ernest's meditations were interrupted by a noise at the outer door. A key was turned in the lock. It must be he, but why so soon? What could have brought him back at this hour? He opened the door and went out into the hall to see what had happened. The figure that he beheld was certainly not the person he expected, but a woman, from whose shoulders a theatre cloak fell in graceful folds, probably a visitor for Reginald. Ernest was about to withdraw discreetly, when the electric light that was burning in the hallway fell upon her face and illumined it. Then, indeed, surprise overcame him. "Ethel," he cried, "is it you?" End of Section 11. The House of the Vampire, by George Sylvester Viereck. Chapter 23. Ernest conducted Ethel Brandenburg to his room and helped her to remove her cloak. While he was placing the garment upon the back of a chair, she slipped a little key into her handbag. He looked at her with a question in his eyes. "Yes," she replied, "I kept the key, but I had not dreamed that I would ever again cross this threshold." Meanwhile it had grown quite dark. The reflection of the street lanterns without dimly lit the room, and through the twilight fantastic shadows seemed to dance. The perfume of her hair pervaded the room and filled the boy's heart with romance. Tenderness long suppressed called with 1,000 voices. The hour, the strangeness and unexpectedness of her visit, perhaps even a boy's pardonable vanity, roused passion from its slumbers, and once again wrought in Ernest's soul the miracle of love. His arm encircled her neck, and his lips stammered blind, sweet, crazy, and caressing things. "Turn on the light," she pleaded. "You are not always so cruel." "No matter. I have not come to speak of love." "Why then have you come?" Ernest felt a little awkward, disappointed as he uttered these words. What could have induced her to come to his rooms? He loosened his hold on her and did as she asked. How pale she looked in the light! How beautiful! Surely she had sorrowed for him, but why had she not answered his letter? Yes, why? "Your letter?" She smiled a little sadly. "Surely you did not expect me to answer that." "Why not?" He had again approached her, and his lips were close to hers. "Why not? I have yearned for you. I love you." His breath intoxicated her. It was like a subtle perfume. Still she did not yield. "You love me now. You did not love me then. The music of your words was cold, machine-made, strained, and superficial. I shall not answer, I told myself. In his heart he has forgotten you. I did not then realize that a dangerous force had possessed your life and crushed in your mind every image but its own." "I don't understand." Do you think I would have come here if it were a mere light matter? No, I tell you, it is a matter of life and death to you, at least as an artist." "What do you mean by that?" "Have you done a stroke of work since I last saw you?" "Yes. Let me see. Surely, magazine articles and a poem." "That is not what I want to know. Have you accomplished anything big? Have you grown since this summer? How about your novel?" "I've almost finished it in my mind, but I have found no chance to begin with the actual writing. I was sick of late, very sick." "No doubt of it." His face was pinched and pale, and the lines about the mouth were curiously contorted, like those of a man suffering from a painful internal disease. "Tell me," she ventured, "do you ever miss anything?" "Do you mean, are there thieves?" "Thieves? Against thieves one can protect oneself." He stared at her wildly, half frightened, in anticipation of some dreadful revelation. His dream! His dream! That hand! Could it be more than a dream? God! His lips quivered. Ethel observed his agitation, and continued more quietly, but with the same insistence. "Have you ever had ideas, plans that you began without having strength to complete them? Have you had glimpses of vocal visions that seemed to vanish no sooner than seen? Did it ever seem to you as if some mysterious and superior will brutally interfered with the workings of your brain?" Did it seem so to him? He himself could not have stated more plainly the experience of the last few months. Each word fell from her lips like the blow of a hammer. Shivering, he put his arm around her, seeking solace, not love. This time she did not repulse him, and trustingly, as a child confides to his mother, he depicted to her the suffering that harrowed his life and made it a hell. As she listened, indignation clouded her forehead, while rising tears of anger and of love weighed down her lashes. She could bear the pitiful sight no longer. "Child," she cried, "do you know who your tormentor is?" And like a flash the truth passed from her to him. A sudden intimation told him what her words had still concealed. "Don't! For Christ's sake, do not pronounce his name!" he sobbed. "Do not breathe it! I could not endure it! I should go mad!" Chapter 24. Very quietly, with difficulty restraining her own emotion so as not to excite him further, Ethel had related to Ernest the story of her remarkable interview with Reginald Clarke. In the long silence that ensued, the wings of his soul brushed against hers for the first time, and love by 1,000 tender chains of common suffering welded their beings into one. Caressingly the ivory of her fingers passed through the gold of his hair and over his brow, as if to banish the demon eyes that stared at him across the hideous spaces of the past. In a rush 1,000 incidents came back to him, mute witnesses of a damning truth. His play, the dreams that tormented him, his own inability to concentrate his mind upon his novel which hitherto he had ascribed to a nervous disease, all piling fact on fact, became one monstrous monument of Reginald Clarke's crime. At last Ernest understood the parting words of Abel Felton, and the look in Ethel's eye on the night when he had first linked his fate with the other man's. Walcome's experience too, and Reginald's remarks on the busts of Shakespeare and Balzac, unmistakably pointed toward the new and horrible spectre that Ethel's revelation had raised in place of his host. And then, again, the other Reginald appeared, crowned with the lyric wreath. From his lips golden cadences fell, sweeter than the smell of many flowers or the sound of a silver bell. He was once more the divine master, whose godlike features bore no trace of malice, and who had raised him to a place very near his heart. "No," he cried, "it is impossible! It's all a dream, a horrible nightmare!" "But he has himself confessed it," she interjected. "Perhaps he has spoken in symbols. We all absorb to some extent other men's ideas without robbing them and wrecking their thought life. Reginald may be unscrupulous in the use of his power of impressing upon others the stamp of his master mind. So was Shakespeare. No, no, no. You are mistaken. We were both deluded for the moment by his picturesque account of a common, not even a discreditable fact. He may himself have played with the idea, but surely he cannot have been serious." "And your own experience, and Abel Felton's and mine, can they too be dismissed with a shrug of the shoulder?" "But come to think of it, the whole theory seems absurd. It is unscientific. It is not even a case of mesmerism. If he had said that he hypnotized his victims, the matter would assume a totally different aspect. I admit that something is wrong somewhere, and that the home of Reginald Clark is no healthful abode for me, but you must also remember that probably we are both unstrung to the point of hysteria." But to Ethel his words carried no conviction. "You are still under his spell," she cried anxiously. A little shaken in his confidence, Ernest resumed, "Reginald is utterly incapable of such an action, even granting that he possessed the terrible power of which you speak. A man of his splendid resources, a literary Midas at whose touch every word turns into gold, is under no necessity to prey on the thoughts of others. Circumstances, I admit, are suspicious, but in the light of common day this fanciful theory shrivels into nothing. Any court of law would reject our evidence as madness. It is too utterly fantastic, utterly alien to any human experience." "Is it, though?" Ethel replied with peculiar intonation. "Why, what do you mean?" "Surely," she answered, "you must know that in the legends of every nation we read of men and women who were called vampires. They are beings, not always wholly evil, whom every night some mysterious impulse leads to steal into unguarded bedchambers, to suck the blood of the sleepers, and then, having waxed strong in the life of their victims, cautiously to retreat. Thence comes it that their lips are very red. It is even said that they can find no rest in the grave, but return to their former haunts long after they are believed to be dead. Those whom they visit, however, pine away for no apparent reason. The physicians shake their wise heads and speak of consumption. But sometimes, ancient chronicles assure us, the people's suspicions were aroused, and under the leadership of good priests they went in solemn procession to the graves of the person suspected, and on opening the tombs it was found that their coffins had rotted away, and the flowers in their hair were black, but their bodies were white and whole. Through no empty sockets crept the vermin, and their sucking lips were still moist with a little blood." Ernest was carried away in spite of himself by her account, which vividly resembled his own experience. Still he would not give in. "All this is impressive. I admit it is very impressive. But you yourself speak of such stories as legends. They are unfounded upon any tangible fact, and you cannot expect a man schooled in modern sciences to admit, as having any possible bearing upon his life, the crude belief of the Middle Ages." "Why not?" she responded. "Our scientists have proved true the wildest theories of medieval scholars. The transmutation of metals seems today no longer an idle speculation, and radium has transformed into potential reality the dream of perpetual motion. The fundamental notions of mathematics are being undermined. One school of philosophers claims that the number of angles in a triangle is equal to more than 2 right angles, another propounds that it is less. Even great scientists who have studied the soul of nature are turning to spiritualism. The world is overcoming the shallow skepticism of the 19th century. Life has become once more wonderful and very mysterious. But it also seems that, with the miracles of the old days, their terrors, their nightmares, and their monsters have come back in a modern guise." Ernest became even more thoughtful. "Yes," he observed, "there is something in what you say." Then, pacing the room nervously, he exclaimed, "And still I find it impossible to believe your explanation. Reginald a vampire! It seems so ludicrous. If you had told me that such creatures exist somewhere far away, I might have discussed the matter. But in this great city, in the shadow of the Flatiron Building, no." She replied with warmth, "Yet they exist, have always existed, not only in the Middle Ages, but at all times and in all regions. There is no nation but has some record of them in one form or another. And don't you think if we find a thought, no matter how absurd it may seem to us, that has ever occupied the minds of men, if we find, I say, such a perennially recurrent thought, are we not justified in assuming that it must have some basis in the actual experience of mankind?" Ernest's brow became very clouded, and infinite numbers of hidden premature wrinkles began to show. How wan he looked, and how frail! He was as one lost in a labyrinth in which he saw no light, convinced against his will, or rather against his scientific conviction, that she was not wholly mistaken. "Still," he observed triumphantly, "your vampires suck blood. But Reginald, if vampire he be, preys upon the soul. How can a man suck from another man's brain a thing as intangible, as quintessential as thought?" "Ah," she replied, "you forget. Thought is more real than blood." End of Section 12. The House of the Vampire by George Sylvester Viereck. Chapter 25. Only 3 hours had passed since Ethel had startled Ernest from his sombre reveries, but within this brief space their love had matured as if each hour had been a year. The pallor had vanished from his cheeks and the restiveness from his eyes. The intoxication of her presence had rekindled the light of his countenance and given him strength to combat the mighty forces embodied in Reginald Clarke. The child in him had made room for the man. He would not hear of surrendering without a struggle, and Ethel felt sure she might leave his fate in his own hand. Love had lent him a coat of mail. He was warned and would not succumb. Still she made one more attempt to persuade him to leave the house at once with her. "I must go now," she said. "Will you not come with me, after all? I am so afraid to think of you still here." "No, dear," he replied, "I shall not desert my post. I must solve the riddle of this man's life, and if indeed he is the thing he seems to be, I shall attempt to wrest from him what he has stolen from me. I speak of my unwritten novel." "Do not attempt to oppose him openly. You cannot resist him." "Be assured that I shall be on my guard. I have in the last few hours lived through so much that makes life worth living that I would not wantonly expose myself to any danger. Still I cannot go without certainty, cannot, if there is some truth in our fears, leave the best of me behind." "What are you planning to do?" "My play. I am sure now that it is mine. I cannot take from him. That is irretrievably lost. He has read it to his circle and prepared for its publication. And no matter how firmly convinced you or I may be of his strange power, no one would believe our testimony. They would pronounce us mad. Perhaps we are mad." "No, we are not mad, but it is mad for you to stay here," she asserted. "I shall not stay here 1 minute longer than is absolutely essential. Within a week I shall have conclusive proof of his guilt or innocence." "How will you go about it?" "His writing table." "Ah!" "Yes, perhaps I can discover some note, some indication, some proof." "It's a dangerous game." "I have everything to gain." "I wish I could stay here with you," she said. "Have you no friend, no one whom you could trust in this delicate matter?" "Why, yes, Jack." A shadow passed over her face. "Do you know," she said, "I have a feeling that you care more for him than for me." "Nonsense," he said. "He is my friend. You immeasurably more." "Are you still as intimate with him as when I first met you?" "Not quite. Of late a troubling something like a thin veil seems to have passed between us. But he will come when I call him. He will not fail me in my hour of need." "When can he be here?" "In 2 or 3 days." "Meanwhile be very careful. Above all, lock your door at night." "I will not only lock, but barricade it. I shall try with all my power to elucidate this mystery without, however, exposing myself to needless risks." "I will go, then. Kiss me good-bye." "May I not take you to the car?" "You had better not." At the door she turned back once more. "Write me every day, or call me up on the telephone." He straightened himself, as if to convince her of his strength. Yet when at last the door had closed behind her, his courage forsook him for a moment. And if he had not been ashamed to appear a weakling before the woman he loved, who knows if any power on earth could have kept him in that house where from every corner a secret seemed to lurk? There was a misgiving, too, in the woman's heart as she left the boy behind, a prey to the occult power that, seeking expression in multiple activities, has made and unmade emperors, prophets, and poets. As she stepped into a street-car, she saw from afar, as in a vision, the face of Reginald Clarke. It seemed very white and hungry. There was no human kindness in it, only a threat and a sneer. Chapter 26. For over an hour Ernest paced up and down his room, wildly excited by Ethel's revelations. It required an immense amount of self-control for him to pen the following lines to Jack: "I need you. Come." After he had entrusted the letter to the hall-boy, a reaction set in, and he was able to consider the matter, if not with equanimity, at least with a degree of calmness. The strangest thing to him was that he could not bring himself to hate Reginald, of whose evil influence upon his life he was now firmly convinced. Here was another shattered idol, but one, like the fragment of a great god-face in the desert, intensely fascinating even in its ruin. Then, yielding to a natural impulse, Ernest looked over his photographs, and at once laid hold upon the austere image of his master and friend. No, it was preposterous. There was no evil in this man. There was no trace of malice in this face, the face of a prophet or an inspired madman, a poet. And yet, as he scrutinized the picture closely, a curious transformation seemed to take place in the features. A sly little line appeared insinuatingly about Reginald's well-formed mouth, and the serene calm of his Jupiter head seemed to turn into the sneak smile of a thief. Nevertheless, Ernest was not afraid. His anxieties had at last assumed definite shape. It was possible now to be on his guard. It was only invisible, incomprehensible fear, crouching upon us from the night, that drives sensitive natures to the verge of madness and transforms stern warriors into cowards. Ernest realized the necessity of postponing the proposed investigation of Reginald's papers until the morning, as it was now near 11, and he expected to hear at any moment the sound of his feet at the door. Before retiring he took a number of precautions. Carefully he locked the door to his bedroom and placed a chair in front of it. To make doubly sure, he fastened the handle to an exquisite Chinese vase, a gift of Reginald's, that at the least attempt to force an entrance from without would come down with a crash. Then, although sleep seemed out of the question, he went to bed. He had hardly touched the pillow when a leaden weight seemed to fall upon his eyes. The day's commotion had been too much for his delicate frame. By force of habit he pulled the cover over his ear and fell asleep. All night he slept heavily, and the morning was far advanced when a knock at the door, that at first seemed to come across an immeasurable distance, brought him back to himself. It was Reginald's manservant announcing that breakfast was waiting. Ernest got up and rubbed his eyes. The barricade at the door at once brought back to his mind with startling clearness the events of the previous evening. Everything was as he had left it. Evidently no one had attempted to enter the room while he slept. He could not help smiling at the arrangement which reminded him of his childhood, when he had sought by similar means security from burglars and bogies. And in the broad daylight Ethel's tales of vampires seemed once more impossible and absurd. Still, he had abundant evidence of Reginald's strange influence, and was determined to know the truth before nightfall. Her words, that thought is more real than blood, kept ringing in his ears. If such was the case, he would find evidence of Reginald's intellectual burglaries, and possibly be able to regain a part of his lost self that had been snatched from him by the relentless dream hand. But under no circumstances could he face Reginald in his present state of mind. He was convinced that if, in the fleeting vision of a moment, the other man's true nature should reveal itself to him, he would be so terribly afraid as to shriek like a maniac. So he dressed particularly slowly, in the hope of avoiding an encounter with his host. But fate thwarted his hope. Reginald, too, lingered that morning unusually long over his coffee. He was just taking his last sip when Ernest entered the room. His behaviour was of an almost bourgeois kindness. Benevolence fairly beamed from his face. But to the boy's eyes it had assumed a new and sinister expression. "You are late this morning, Ernest," he remarked in his mildest manner. "Have you been about town, or writing poetry? Both occupations are equally unhealthy." As he said this, he watched the young man with an inscrutable smile that at moments was wont to curl upon his lips. Ernest had once likened it to the smile of Mona Lisa, but now he detected in it the suavity of the hypocrite and the leer of the criminal. He could not endure it. He could not look upon that face any longer. His feet almost gave way under him, cold sweat gathered on his brow, and he sank on a chair trembling and studiously avoiding the other man's gaze. At last Reginald rose to go. It seemed impossible to accuse this splendid impersonation of vigorous manhood of cunning and underhand methods, of plagiarisms and theft. As he stood there he resembled more than anything a beautiful tiger-cat, a wonderful thing of strength and will-power, indomitable and insatiate. Yet who could tell whether this strength was not, after all, parasitic? If Ethel's suspicions were justified, then, indeed, more had been taken from him than he could ever realize. For in that case it was his life-blood that circled in those veins, and the fire of his intellect that set those lips aflame. End of Section 13. The House of the Vampire by George Sylvester Viereck. Chapter 27. Reginald Clark had hardly left the room when Ernest hastily rose from his seat. While it was likely that he would remain in undisturbed possession of the apartment the whole morning, the stake at hand was too great to permit of delay. Palpitating and a little uncertain, he entered the studio where, scarcely a year ago, Reginald Clark had bidden him welcome. Nothing had changed there since then. Only in Ernest's mind the room had assumed an aspect of evil. The Antinous was there, and the faun, and the Christ-head, but their juxtaposition to-day partook of the nature of the blasphemous. The statues of Shakespeare and Balzac seemed to frown from their pedestals as his fingers were running through Reginald's papers. He brushed against a semblance of Napoleon that was standing on the writing-table, so that it toppled over and made a noise that weirdly re-echoed in the silence of the room. At that moment a curious family resemblance between Shakespeare, Balzac, Napoleon, and Reginald forcibly impressed itself upon his mind. It was the indisputable something that marks those who were chosen to give ultimate expression to some gigantic world purpose. In Balzac's face it was diffused with kindliness, in that of Napoleon sheer brutality predominated. The image of one who was said to be the richest man of the world also rose before his eyes. Perhaps it was only the play of his fevered imagination, but he could have sworn that this man's features too bore the mark of those unoriginal, great absorptive minds, who for better or for worse are born to rob and rule. They seemed to him monsters that know neither justice nor pity, only the law of their being, the law of growth. Common weapons would not avail against such forces. Being one, they were stronger than armies, nor could they be overcome in single combat. Stealth, trickery, the outfit of the knave, were legitimate weapons in such a fight. In this case the end justified the means, even if the latter included burglary. After a brief and fruitless search of the desk, he attempted to force open a secret drawer, the presence of which he had one day accidentally discovered. He tried a number of keys to no account, and was thinking of giving up his researches for the day until he had procured a skeleton key, when at last the lock gave way. The drawer disclosed a large file of manuscript. Ernest paused for a moment to draw breath. The paper rustled under his nervous fingers. And there, at last, his eyes lit upon a bulky bundle that bore this legend: Leontina, a novel. It was true, then, all, his dream, Reginald's confession, and the house that had opened its doors so kindly to him was the house of a vampire. Finally curiosity overcame his burning indignation. He attempted to read. The letters seemed to dance before his eyes. His hands trembled. At last he succeeded. The words that had first rolled over like drunken soldiers now marched before his vision in orderly sequence. He was delighted, then stunned. This was indeed authentic literature, there could be no doubt about it, and it was his. He was still a poet, a great poet. He drew a deep breath. Sudden joy trembled in his heart. This story set down by a foreign hand had grown chapter by chapter in his brain. There were some slight changes, slight deviations from the original plan. A defter hand than his had retouched it here and there, but for all that it remained his very own. It did not belong to that thief. The blood welled to his cheek as he uttered the word that, applied to Reginald, seemed almost sacrilegious. He had nearly reached the last chapter when he heard steps in the hallway. Hurriedly he restored the manuscript to its place, closed the drawer, and left the room on tiptoe. It was Reginald, but he did not come alone. Someone was speaking to him. The voice seemed familiar. Ernest could not make out what it said. He listened intently, and was it possible? Jack? Surely he could not yet have come in response to his note. What mysterious power, what dim presentiment of his friend's plight had led him thither? But why did he linger so long in Reginald's room instead of hastening to greet him? Cautiously he drew near. This time he caught Jack's words. "It would be convenient and pleasant. Still someway I feel that it is not right for me, of all men, to take his place here." "That need not concern you," Reginald deliberately replied. "The dear boy expressed the desire to leave me within a fortnight. I think he will go to some private sanitarium. His nerves are frightfully overstrained." "This seems hardly surprising after the terrible attack he had when you read your play." "That idea has since then developed into a monomania." "I am awfully sorry for him. I cared for him much, perhaps too much, but I always feared that he would come to such an end. Of late his letters have been strangely unbalanced." "You will find him very much changed. In fact, he is no longer the same." "No," said Jack, "he is no longer the friend I loved." Ernest clutched for the wall. His face was contorted with intense agony. Each word was like a nail driven into his flesh. Crucified upon the cross of his own affection by the hand he loved, all white and trembling he stood there. Tears rushed to his eyes, but he could not weep. Dry-eyed he reached his room and threw himself upon his bed. Thus he lay, uncomforted and alone. Chapter 28. Terrible as was his loneliness, a meeting with Jack would have been more terrible, and after all it was true, a gulf had opened between them. Ethel alone could bring solace to his soul. There was a great void in his heart which only she could fill. He hungered for the touch of her hand. He longed for her presence strongly, as a wanton lusts for pleasure and as sad men crave death. Noiselessly he stole to the door so as not to arouse the attention of the other two men, whose every whisper pierced his heart like a dagger. When he came to Ethel's home he found that she had gone out for a breath of air. The servant ushered him into the parlour, and there he waited for her. Greatly calmed by his walk, he turned the details of Clark's conversation over in his mind, and the conviction grew upon him that the friend of his boyhood was not to blame for his course of action. Reginald probably had encircled Jack's soul with his demoniacal influence, and singled him out for another victim. That must never be. It was his turn to save now. He would warn his friend of the danger that threatened him, even if his words should be spoken into the wind. For Reginald, with an ingenuity almost satanic, had already suggested that the delusion of former days had developed into a monomania, and any attempt on his part to warn Jack would only seem to confirm this theory. In that case only one way was left open. He must plead with Reginald himself, confront at all risks that snatcher of souls. Tonight he would not fall asleep, he would keep his vigil, and if Reginald should approach his room, if in some way he felt the direful presence, he must speak out, threaten if need be, to save his friend from ruin. He had fully determined upon this course when a cry of joy from Ethel, who had just returned from her walk, interrupted his reverie. But her gladness changed to anxiety when she saw how pale he was. Ernest recounted to her the happenings of the day, from the discovery of his novel in Reginald's desk to the conversation which he had accidentally overheard. He noticed that her features brightened as he drew near the end of his tale. "Was your novel finished?" she suddenly asked. "I think so." "Then you are out of danger. He will want nothing else of you. But you should have taken it with you." "I had only sufficient presence of mind to slip it back into the drawer. Tomorrow I shall simply demand it." "You will do nothing of the kind. It is in his handwriting, and you have no legal proof that it is yours. You must take it away secretly, and he will not dare to reclaim it." "And Jack?" She had quite forgotten Jack. Women are invariably selfish for those they love. "You must warn him," she replied. "He would laugh at me. However, I must speak to Reginald." "It is of no avail to speak to him. At least you must not do so before you have obtained the manuscript. It would unnecessarily jeopardize our plans." "And after?" "After, perhaps, but you must not expose yourself to any danger." "No, dear," he said, and kissed her. What danger is there, provided I keep my wits about me? He steals upon men only in their sleep and in the dark." "Be careful, nevertheless." "I shall. In fact, I think he is not at home at this moment. If I go now I may be able to get hold of the manuscript and hide it before he returns." "I cannot but tremble to think of you in that house." "You shall have no more reason to tremble in a day or two." "Shall I see you to-morrow?" "I don't think so. I must go over my papers and things, so as to be ready at any moment to leave the house." "And then?" "Then?" He took her in his arms and looked long and deeply into her eyes. "Yes," she replied. "At least, perhaps." Then he turned to go, resolute and happy. How strangely he had matured since the summer! Her heart swelled with the consciousness that it was her love that had effected this transformation. "As I cannot expect you to-morrow, I shall probably go to the opera, but I shall be home before midnight. Will you call me up then? A word from you will put me at ease for the night, even if it comes over the telephone." "I will call you up. We moderns have an advantage over the ancients in this respect. The 20th century Pyramus can speak to Thisbe, even if innumerable walls sever his body from hers." "A quaint conceit! But let us hope that our love story will end less tragically," she said, tenderly caressing his hair. "Oh, we shall be happy, you and I," she added after a while. "The iron finger of fate that lay so heavily on our lives is now withdrawn, almost withdrawn. Yes, almost, only almost." And then a sudden fear came over her. "No," she cried, "do not go, do not go. Stay with me, stay here. I feel so frightened. I don't know what comes over me. I am afraid, afraid for you." "No, dear," he rejoined, "you need not be afraid. In your heart you don't want me to desert a friend, and besides leave the best part of my artistic life in Reginald's clutch. Why should you expose yourself to God knows what danger for a friend who is ready to betray you? You forget friendship is a gift. If it exacts payment in any form, it is no longer either friendship or a gift. And you yourself have assured me that I have nothing to fear from Reginald. I have nothing to give to him." She rallied under his words, and had regained her self-possession when the door closed behind him. He walked a few blocks very briskly. Then his pace slackened. Her words had unsettled him a little, and when he reached home he did not at once resume his exploration of Reginald's papers. He had hardly lit a cigarette when, at an unusually early hour, he heard Reginald's key in the lock. Quickly he turned the light out, and in the semi-darkness, lit up by an electric lantern below, barricaded the door as on the previous night. Then he went to bed without finding sleep. Supreme silence reigned over the house. Even the elevator had ceased to run. Ernest's brain was all ear. He heard Reginald walking up and down in the studio. Not the smallest movement escaped his attention. Thus hours passed. When the clock struck 12 he was still walking up and down and up and down. 1 o'clock. Still the measured beat of his footfall had not ceased. There was something hypnotic in the regular tread. Nature at last exacted its toll from the boy. He fell asleep. Hardly had he closed his eyes when again that horrible nightmare, no longer a nightmare, tormented him. Again he felt the pointed, delicate fingers carefully feeling their way along the innumerable tangled threads of nerve matter that lead to the innermost recesses of self. A subconscious something strove to arouse him, and he felt the fingers softly withdrawn. He could have sworn that he heard the scurrying of feet in the room. Bathed in perspiration, he made a leap for the electric light. But there was no sign of any human presence. The barricade at the door was undisturbed. But fear like a great wind filled the wings of his soul. Yet there was nothing to warrant his conviction that Reginald Clarke had been with him only a few moments ago, plying his horrible trade. The large mirror above the fireplace only showed him his own face, white, excited, the face of a madman. End of section 14. The House of the Vampire by George Sylvester Viereck. Chapter 29. The next morning's mail brought a letter from Ethel, a few lines of encouragement and affection. Yes, she was right. It would not do for him to stay under one roof with Reginald any longer. He must only obtain the manuscript, and if possible surprise him in the attempt to exercise his mysterious and criminal power. Then he would be in the position to dictate terms, and to demand Jack's safety as the price of his silence. Reginald, however, had closeted himself that day in his studio busily writing. Only the clatter of his typewriter announced his presence in the house. There was no chance for conversation, or for obtaining the precious manuscript of Leontina. Meanwhile Ernest was looking over his papers and preparing everything for a quick departure. Glancing over old letters and notes, he became readily interested and hardly noticed the passage of the hours. When the night came he only partly undressed and threw himself upon the bed. It was now 10. At 12 he had promised Ethel to speak to her over the telephone. He was determined not to sleep at all that night. At last he would discover whether or not the previous night and other nights Reginald had secretly entered his room. When 1 hour had passed without incident, his attention relaxed a little. His eyes were gradually closing, when suddenly something seemed to stir at the door. The Chinese vase came rattling to the floor. At once Ernest sprang up. His face had blanched with terror. It was whiter than the linen in which they wrap the dead. But his soul was resolute. He touched a button, and the electric light illuminated the whole chamber. There was no nook for even a shadow to hide. Yet there was no one to be seen. From without the door came no sound. Suddenly something soft touched his foot. He gathered all his will-power so as not to break out into a frenzied shriek. Then he laughed, not a hearty laugh, to be sure. A tiny nose and tail gracefully curled were brushing against him. The source of the disturbance was a little Maltese cat, his favourite, that by some chance had remained in his room. After its essay at midnight gymnastics, the animal quieted down and lay purring at the foot of his bed. The presence of a living thing was a certain comfort, and the reservoir of his strength was well nigh exhausted. He dimly remembered his promise to Ethel, but his lids drooped with sheer weariness. Perhaps an hour passed in this way, when suddenly his blood congealed with dread. He felt the presence of the hand of Reginald Clarke unmistakably groping in his brain, as if searching for something that had still escaped him. He tried to move, to cry out, but his limbs were paralyzed. When by a superhuman effort he at last succeeded in shaking off the numbness that held him enchained, he awoke just in time to see a figure, that of a man, disappearing in the wall that separated Reginald's apartments from his room. This time it was no delusion of the senses. He heard something like a secret door softly closing behind retreating steps. A sudden fierce anger seized him. He was oblivious of the danger, of the terrible power of the older man, oblivious of the love he had once borne him, oblivious of everything save the sense of outraged humanity and outraged right. The law permits us to shoot a burglar who goes through our pockets at night. Must he tolerate the ravages of this 1,000 times more dastardly and dangerous spiritual thief? Was Reginald to enjoy the fruit of other men's labour unpunished? Was he to continue growing into the mightiest literary factor of the century by preying upon his betters? Abel, Walcom, Ethel, he, Jack, were they all to be victims of this insatiable monster? Was this force resistless as it was relentless? No, 1,000 times no. He dashed himself against the wall at the place where the shadow of Reginald Clarke had disappeared. In doing so he touched upon a secret spring. The wall gave way noiselessly. Speechless with rage, he crossed the next room and the one adjoining it, and stood in Reginald's studio. The room was brilliantly lighted, and Reginald, still dressed, was seated at his writing-table scribbling notes upon little scraps of paper in his accustomed manner. At Ernest's approach he looked up without evincing the least sign of terror or surprise. Calmly, almost majestically, he folded his arms over his breast, but there was a menacing glitter in his eyes as he confronted his victim. Chapter 30. Silently the two men faced each other. Then Ernest hissed, "Thief!" Reginald shrugged his shoulders. "Vampire! So Ethel has infected you with her absurd fancies. Poor boy! I am afraid I have been wanting to tell you for some time, but I think we have reached the parting of our road." And that you dare to tell me?" The more he raged, the calmer Reginald seemed to become. "Really," he said, "I fail to understand. I must ask you to leave my room." "You fail to understand? You cad!" Ernest cried. He stepped to the writing table and opened the secret drawer with a blow. A bundle of manuscripts fell on the floor with a strange rustling noise. Then, seizing his own story, he hurled it upon the table. And behold, the last pages bore corrections in ink that could have been made only a few minutes ago. Reginald smiled. "Have you come to play havoc with my manuscripts?" he remarked. "Your manuscripts? Reginald Clarke, you are an impudent impostor. You have written no word that is your own. You are an embezzler of the mind, strutting through life in borrowed and stolen plumes." And at once the mask fell from Reginald's face. "Why stolen?" he coolly said, with a slight touch of irritation. "I absorb, I appropriate. That is the most any artist can say for himself. God creates, man moulds. He gives us the colors, we mix them." "That is not the question. I charge you with having wilfully and criminally interfered in my life. I charge you with having robbed me of what was mine. I charge you with being utterly vile and rapacious, a hypocrite and a parasite." "Foolish boy," Reginald rejoined austerely. "It is through me that the best in you shall survive, even as the obscure Elizabethans live in him of Avon. Shakespeare absorbed what was great in little men, a greatness that otherwise would have perished, and gave it a setting, a life. A thief may plead the same. I understand you better. It is your inordinate vanity that prompts you to abuse your monstrous power." "You err. Self-love has never entered into my actions. I am careless of personal fame. Look at me, boy. As I stand before you, I am Homer, I am Shakespeare, I am every cosmic manifestation in art. Men have doubted in each incarnation my individual existence. Historians have more to tell of the meanest Athenian scribble or Elizabethan poetaster than of me. The radiance of my work obscured my very self. I care not. I have a mission. I am the servant of the Lord. I am the vessel that bears the host." He stood up at full length, the personification of grandeur and power. A tremendous force trembled in his very fingertips. He was like a gigantic dynamo, charged with the might of 10,000 magnetic storms that shake the earth in its orbit and lash myriads of planets through infinities of space. Under ordinary circumstances Ernest or any other man would have quailed before him. But the boy in that epic moment had grown out of his stature. He felt the sword of vengeance in his hands. To him was entrusted the cause of Abel and of Waucom, of Ethel and of Jack. His was the struggle of the individual soul against the same blind and cruel fate that in the past had fashioned the ichthyosaurus and the mastodon. "By what right," he cried, "do you assume that you are the literary Messiah? Who appointed you? What divine power has made you the steward of my might and of theirs whom you have robbed?" "I am a light-bearer. I tread the high hills of mankind. I point the way to the future. I light up the abysses of the past. Were not my stature gigantic, how could I hold the torch in all men's sight? The very souls that I tread underfoot realize, as their dying gaze follows me, the possibilities with which the future is big. Eternally secure, I carry the essence of what is cosmic, of what is divine. I am Homer, Goethe, Shakespeare. I am an embodiment of the same force of which Alexander, Caesar, Confucius, and the Christos were also embodiments. None so strong as to resist me." A sudden madness overcame Ernest at this boast. He must strike now or never. He must rid humanity of this dangerous maniac, this demon of strength. With a power 10 times intensified, he raised a heavy chair so as to hurl it at Reginald's head and crush it. Reginald stood there calmly, a smile upon his lips. Primal cruelties rose from the depth of his nature. Still he smiled, turning his luminous gaze upon the boy. And behold, Ernest's hand began to shake, the chair fell from his grasp. He tried to call for help, but no sound issued from his lips. Utterly paralyzed, he confronted the force. Minutes, eternities passed, and still those eyes were fixed upon him. But this was no longer Reginald. It was all brain, only brain, a tremendous brain machine, infinitely complex, infinitely strong. Not more than a mile away Ethel endeavoured to call to him through the night. The telephone rang once, twice, thrice, insistingly, but Ernest heard it not. Something dragged him, dragged the nerves from his body, dragged, dragged, dragged. It was an irresistible suction, pitiless, passionless, immense. Sparks, blue, crimson, and violet, seemed to play around the living battery. It reached the finest fibres of his mind. Slowly every trace of mentality disappeared. First the will, then feeling, judgment, memory, fear even. All that was stored in his brain cells came forth to be absorbed by that mighty engine. The princess with the yellow veil appeared, flitted across the room, and melted away. She was followed by childhood memories, girls' heads, boys' faces. He saw his dead mother waving her arms to him. An expression of death agony distorted the placid features. Then throwing a kiss to him, she too disappeared. Picture on picture followed. Words of love that he had spoken, sins, virtues, magnanimities, meannesses, terrors, mathematical formulas even, and snatches of songs. Leontina came and was swallowed up. No, it was Ethel who was trying to speak to him, trying to warn. She waved her hands in frantic despair. She was gone. A pale face, dark, dishevelled hair. Jack! How he had changed! He was in the circle of the vampire's transforming might. Jack! He cried. Surely Jack had something to explain, something to tell him, some word that if spoken would bring rest to his soul. He saw the words rise to the boy's lips, but before he had time to utter them his image also had vanished. And Reginald too was gone. There was only the mighty brain, panting, whirling. Then there was nothing. The annihilation of Ernest Fielding was complete. Vacantly he stared at the walls, at the room, and at his master. The latter was wiping the sweat from his forehead. He breathed deeply. The flush of youth spread over his features. His eyes sparkled with a new and dangerous brilliancy. He took the thing that had once been Ernest Fielding by the hand and led it to its room. Chapter 31. With the first flush of the morning Ethel appeared at the door of the house on Riverside Drive. She had not heard from Ernest, and had been unable to obtain connection with him at the telephone. Anxiety had hastened her steps. She brushed against Jack, who was also directing his steps to the abode of Reginald Clark. At the same time, something that resembled Ernest Fielding passed from the house of the vampire. It was a dull and brutish thing, hideously transformed, without a vestige of mind. "Mr. Fielding!" cried Ethel, beside herself with fear as she saw him descending. "Ernest!" Jack gasped, no less startled at the change in his friend's appearance. Ernest's head followed the source of the sound, but no spark of recognition illumined the deadness of his eyes. Without a present and without a past, blindly, a gibbering idiot, he stumbled down the stairs. End of Section 15. End of The House of the Vampire by George Sylvester Viereck.